What if I told you that one of the most profitable systems in early America wasn't built on crops, land, or factories, but on human birth? That may sound shocking, and it should. When most people think about American slavery, they picture forced labor in cotton fields, chains, and whips. That image is real, but it's incomplete. Because beneath the surface of forced labor existed something even darker, a calculated system where enslaved people were reproduced for profit. This is the part of history that rarely makes it into textbooks. In 1808, the United States officially banned the transatlantic slave trade. No more enslaved Africans could be legally imported. Many assumed this weakened slavery. In reality, it did the opposite. Instead of ending the system, enslavers adapted. They turned inward, and they realized something chilling. If they couldn't buy people from overseas, they could produce them at home. From that moment on, enslaved people weren't just laborers, they became investments, and their bodies, especially the bodies of enslaved women, became economic tools. Under American law, enslaved people were classified as property, but one legal principle shaped everything. Children inherited the enslaved status of their mother. That meant every child born into slavery automatically belonged to the enslaver. No contracts, no exceptions, no humanity. Birth itself became profit. A single enslaved woman could be forced to give birth repeatedly, and each child increased the enslaver's wealth. These children could be put to work, rented out, or sold. Human life was reduced to numbers on a ledger. This wasn't hidden, it wasn't secret. Plantation records openly tracked increase, listing births alongside livestock counts and crop yields. Enslavers calculated future profits based on how many children a woman might bear. And yet, this reality is often softened or erased entirely. We're told enslaved people formed families, as if those families existed freely. But how do you form a family when your spouse can be sold tomorrow? When your child can be taken at any moment, when your body doesn't belong to you? The truth is, enslaved people loved fiercely despite the system designed to destroy those bonds. Slave breeding was not always carried out in the same way. In some cases, enslavers forced pairings between men and women, pressuring or coercing them to produce children. In other cases, it involved outright sexual violence. Enslaved women had no legal protection against assault. Consent did not exist. And the children born from this system were never seen as children first. They were assets. This reality challenges the comforting myths many grow up with, that slavery was simply a labor system or that it was less brutal in America than elsewhere. It forces us to confront something far more disturbing. Slavery in the United States was a system of total domination over human life. Not just work, not just movement, but reproduction, family, future. Understanding this truth changes how we understand American history itself, because the wealth built during this period didn't come only from fields and factories. It came from the forced multiplication of human beings. And this is only the beginning. Next, we'll expose how enslaved women were reduced to what enslavers coldly referred to as breeding stock, and how the language of farming was used to justify unimaginable cruelty. If you believe history should be told honestly, subscribe to this channel, share this video so more people can learn what was hidden, and leave a comment below, because the stories they tried hardest to erase are the ones we need to hear the most.
If you want to understand the true brutality of American slavery, look closely at the language enslavers used, because language reveals how they fought. In plantation records, enslaved women were not described as daughters, wives, or mothers. They were described as prime, healthy, strong, and good breeders. The same words used for animals were applied to human beings. This wasn't metaphorical. It was literal. By the early 19th century, enslavers openly treated reproduction as an economic strategy. After the international slave trade ended, the value of enslaved people born in America skyrocketed. A woman's worth was increasingly measured not by who she was, but by how many children she could produce. Enslaved women's bodies became sites of extraction, just like land. Young girls were evaluated early. Puberty marked not a transition to adulthood, but a shift in market value. Once deemed capable of childbirth, pressure followed quickly. Frequent pregnancies were encouraged. Recovery time was ignored. Pain was irrelevant. Plantation owners kept detailed records tracking births, spacing, and survival rates. A woman who produced many children was labeled valuable. One who could not was punished, sold, or discarded. This is what it means when historians say enslaved people were treated as property. Not symbolically, not philosophically, practically. The legal system supported this dehumanization completely. Because children inherited the enslaved status of their mother, enslavers had total incentive to control women's reproduction. There was no financial downside. Every birth meant guaranteed ownership. And this control went far beyond encouragement.
On some plantations, enslavers arranged forced pairings, pressuring men and women to have children regardless of emotional bonds. In other cases, reproduction occurred through systematic sexual violence by enslavers or overseers. Enslaved women could not testify against white men in court. There was no crime to report. Sexual assault wasn't considered a violation. It was considered a right. What's often missing from popular narratives is the constant resistance of enslaved women. Despite unimaginable risk, many resisted in quiet, dangerous ways. Some attempted to avoid pregnancy altogether. Others formed secret relationships, trying to preserve dignity and choice where they could. Some resisted emotionally, refusing to let enslavers control their sense of self, even when their bodies were trapped. But resistance came at a cost. Women who resisted sexual access or refused forced pairings were beaten, sold, or separated from loved ones. Pregnancy did not protect them from labor. Many were sent back to the fields weeks or even days after giving birth. Infants were sometimes left unattended while mothers worked, leading to illness and death. And even motherhood offered no safety. Children born into slavery were never guaranteed to stay with their parents. In fact, they were often seen as future currency. A child could be sold to pay debts, fund expansion, or reward loyalty. Love did not matter. Biology did not matter. Profit did. This reality destroys the myth that enslaved families were stable or protected. Families existed, but under constant threat. Every embrace carried fear. Every birth came with dread. When enslavers described women as good breeders, they stripped away identity and humanity entirely. The phrase itself tells us everything we need to know. These were not people to them. They were production units. Understanding this is uncomfortable. It forces us to confront the fact that American slavery was not simply cruel, it was calculated. It relied on laws, accounting, and social acceptance. And it thrived because society allowed it to. In the next part of this series, we'll confront one of the hardest truths of all, how sexual violence functioned as a system of power and control, and why it was essential to sustaining slavery itself. If this story is teaching you something you were never told, subscribe to this channel and share this video. And leave a comment below. The history is still so often minimized or ignored, because confronting the truth is the only way history stops repeating itself.
To understand American slavery honestly, we have to confront a truth that history has long tried to soften. Sexual violence was not a side effect of slavery. It was a system that sustained it. This is one of the most uncomfortable parts of the story, and that discomfort is exactly why it's so often ignored. Enslaved women lived under constant threat of sexual assault, not occasionally, not in isolated cases, but as a daily reality embedded into the structure of slavery itself. Enslavers, overseers, and slave traders held absolute power over enslaved women's bodies, and the law offered no protection, none. In the eyes of the legal system, enslaved women could not be raped because they were considered property. And property, by definition, could not refuse its owner. This legal reality created an environment where abuse required no secrecy. Sexual violence was often carried out openly, repeatedly, and without consequence. It was a tool of domination, humiliation, and reproduction all at once. For enslavers, sexual access reinforced power. It reminded enslaved women and enslaved men that resistance was futile. It destroyed family bonds, it bred fear, and in many cases, it produced children who would themselves be enslaved, further enriching the system. This is what historians mean when they say slavery was total control over human life. The violence didn't stop with individual acts. On some plantations, enslavers actively interfered in relationships, preventing bonds that might encourage loyalty between enslaved people rather than obedience to the owner. Emotional attachment was seen as dangerous. Love was a liability. Some enslavers encouraged forced pairings, believing it would increase birth rates. Others relied entirely on coercion and assault. Either way, consent never entered the equation.
Enslaved men were also victims of this system, forced to watch partners assaulted, children fathered by enslavers, and families fractured by violence they were powerless to stop. This psychological cruelty was intentional. It reinforced submission through helplessness. And yet, within this terror, enslaved women resisted in extraordinary ways. Resistance did not always look like rebellion. Often it was quiet and desperate. Some women attempted to control their fertility using dangerous herbal methods. Others avoided relationships altogether. Some formed secret emotional bonds, clinging to humanity where they could. Others resisted internally, refusing to let enslavers define their worth even when their bodies were violated. But resistance came with punishment. Women who rejected sexual advances could be beaten, starved, or sold. Sale was one of the most feared consequences, not just because of physical danger, but because it meant permanent separation from children, parents, or partners. Pregnancy did not bring safety. In many cases, it increased exploitation. Pregnant women continued heavy labor. Miscarriages were common. Infant mortality was devastatingly high. And children born from sexual violence carried lifelong consequences. They were reminders of trauma for their mothers. They were also caught between worlds, sometimes lighter-skinned, sometimes acknowledged by enslavers, sometimes rejected entirely. Their existence exposed the hypocrisy of a society that preached morality while profiting from abuse. This history is painful to hear, but it's essential to understand. Because sexual violence wasn't just personal cruelty, it was structural. It fueled population growth, it enforced racial hierarchy, it normalized domination, and it shaped the social and racial dynamics that still echo today. Ignoring this truth allows false narratives to survive. Narratives that minimize the brutality of slavery or frame it as less violent than it was. Confronting it honors the reality endured by millions whose voices were silenced. We'll examine how this violence fed directly into the domestic slave trade and how families were systematically torn apart for profit. If you believe these stories deserve to be told with honesty and respect, subscribe to this channel and share this video. And leave a comment below acknowledging the resilience of those who endured this system, because remembering them is an act of resistance in itself.
Imagine giving birth knowing that your child could be taken from you the next day. For enslaved parents in America, this was not imagination, it was reality. And for millions of enslaved people, it was a reality enforced by one of the cruelest aspects of slavery, the domestic slave trade. After 1808, when the transatlantic slave trade was banned, enslavers in the Upper South realized a new profit opportunity. They could sell enslaved people to the Deep South for labor in cotton, sugar, and tobacco plantations. States like Virginia, Maryland, and Kentucky became major exporters of human lives. Families were torn apart systematically, not as a byproduct of slavery, but as part of a deliberate economic system. Children were prime assets. Boys and girls alike were evaluated for their future labor potential. Infants were not spared. Often, children were sold at auctions, while parents were forced to watch, powerless to intervene. Mothers screamed as babies were carried away. Fathers were restrained, sometimes physically, sometimes by threat. These scenes were common across the South, recorded in advertisements, estate inventories, and newspapers. The phrase, "sold down the river," was literal, a euphemism for forced relocation, often thousands of miles away from family and home. It's impossible to overstate the psychological toll. Parents were forced to endure unbearable loss repeatedly. Some children were sold as infants, others as toddlers, and some as teenagers. Even when families were allowed to stay together temporarily, the looming threat of sale created constant fear. Every embrace was tinged with dread, every lullaby a reminder that separation could come at any moment. Enslaved people developed extraordinary resilience and strategies to survive under these conditions. Some formed surrogate families among neighbors or distant relatives. Some tried to hide children during sales, though punishment for this was severe. Others relied on spiritual practices and community networks to maintain emotional strength and a sense of continuity in the face of systemic destruction.
Yet, resistance could never fully prevent the consequences of a system designed to treat humans as property. Parents learned to grieve in advance. They celebrated milestones quietly, knowing that joy could be taken away at any time. Children learned early to understand that their bodies and futures were not their own. This generational trauma is one reason why the effects of slavery are still felt centuries later. It wasn't just children. Spouses were routinely separated, leaving marriages unprotected and unstable. Mothers and fathers lost not only their children, but also the partners they depended on. The emotional devastation was intentional. By breaking familial bonds, enslavers weakened emotional loyalty among the enslaved population, ensuring obedience and minimizing collective resistance. Auction houses, river ports, and plantation markets became tools of psychological warfare. Wealthy buyers openly competed for the best enslaved individuals, sometimes inspecting families and children as if evaluating livestock. This commodification reinforced the idea that human beings were assets, not people, a lesson engraved into the minds of both enslavers and enslaved. Despite all this, enslaved families fought to maintain connections whenever possible. Letters, secret messages, and clandestine visits were methods of keeping bonds alive. These acts of defiance remind us that even in the harshest conditions, humanity persisted. Love, care, and family ties were maintained, though under constant threat. Understanding the domestic slave trade is essential to understanding slavery itself. It shows that slavery wasn't just about labor, it was about control over every aspect of life. Births, marriages, childhoods, and futures were all exploited for profit. Wealth wasn't just built on toil in the fields, it was built on the tearing apart of human lives, generation after generation. We'll explore how the psychological terror of slavery went even deeper, beyond physical abuse, beyond forced separation, to shape minds, families, and communities for generations to come. If this story moved you, subscribe to this channel and share it so more people can learn the truth about the domestic slave trade. Comment below. How do you think the forced separation of families shaped American history? Because the stories of loss, resilience, and survival deserve to be remembered, and their lessons must never be forgotten.
Slavery was more than chains, crops, and cruel labor. It was a war on the human mind. The physical brutality of the fields was only part of the system. The real weapon was fear, carefully calculated, persistent, and all-encompassing. Enslaved people were made to live in a constant state of uncertainty. Every day brought the possibility of punishment, sale, or separation from loved ones. Parents knew that even if they survived the labor, their children might be taken away. Children learned that their lives were not their own, and every moment of joy was shadowed by dread. This fear was not incidental, it was structural, built into every law, custom, and practice of slavery. The constant threat of violence and family separation created a psychological environment designed to enforce submission. Enslaved people were taught to anticipate loss, to expect betrayal, and to restrain their emotions. Love and family ties were simultaneously encouraged and punished. Mothers loved their children but could not protect them. Fathers tried to guide their families but had no legal authority. Even the strongest bonds could be broken at the whims of a buyer or overseer. This terror extended beyond the immediate threat of sale or physical abuse. It shaped relationships, self-perception, and the sense of what was possible in life. Enslaved people had to navigate an environment in which trust was dangerous, attachment could bring pain, and resistance carried deadly risk. The mental burden was relentless. Decades of survival under such conditions left scars that went far deeper than bruises or cuts. Children growing up in slavery were forced to internalize these harsh lessons early. They learned that their parents could not always protect them. They observed injustice and cruelty and realized that the world they lived in would not be fair or safe. The lessons of fear and vigilance became survival skills, skills that would be carried across generations, long after emancipation.
This psychological oppression was compounded by the ways enslavers controlled family and social life. Marriage among enslaved people was not legally recognized. Family structures could be reshaped or dissolved at will. Relationships were scrutinized, manipulated, and sometimes broken outright to prevent unity that might threaten the authority of the enslaver. The enslaved population was kept in a state of perpetual instability, ensuring that resistance would be fragmented and survival would remain the primary goal. Yet even in this environment of fear, enslaved people found ways to resist psychologically and emotionally. Secret rituals, spiritual practices, and storytelling became tools for maintaining identity and hope. Families nurtured one another in subtle ways, sharing knowledge, teaching children values, and preserving culture despite constant threats. These small acts of defiance helped sustain humanity in the face of systematic dehumanization. This psychological warfare also had long-term consequences. Trauma passed down from generation to generation shaped communities, social structures, and cultural memory. Patterns of caution, emotional restraint, and survival strategies were inherited because the experiences of slavery were too profound to simply vanish. Understanding this mental and emotional legacy is essential to understanding modern American society, its inequalities, and the enduring impacts of systemic oppression. The terror of slavery reminds us that oppression does not have to leave physical scars to be devastating. Sometimes the most enduring damage is in the mind and spirit, silently shaping lives across decades. Recognizing this truth challenges the sanitized narratives of slavery that present it as only an economic or labor system. Slavery was total control, not just over bodies, but over thoughts, relationships, and the very possibility of hope. We will examine why this history matters today, how the effects of slave breeding and systemic trauma continue to echo, and why confronting these uncomfortable truths is crucial for an honest understanding of America. If this story is reshaping how you think about slavery, subscribe and share this video. Leave a comment below. How do you think the psychological trauma of slavery has shaped generations today? Because remembering and acknowledging this trauma is not just about the past, it's about understanding the present and shaping a more just future.
The past is never truly past. That is one of the hardest lessons of history, and one of the most important. The horrors of slavery, and specifically the deliberate breeding and dehumanization of enslaved people, did not end with emancipation. Its echoes are everywhere, in family structures, economic inequality, social dynamics, and collective memory. To understand America today, we must confront the full reality of this history. Slave breeding reveals a truth that is difficult to face. Slavery wasn't just about labor. It wasn't just about producing wealth in the fields or factories. It was about total domination over human life, bodies, families, sexuality, and futures. Enslavers sought to control not just work output, but reproduction, love, and identity. They treated children as property, families as assets, and women as production units. This systemic abuse created trauma that did not vanish when the chains were removed. Even today, the legacy of this trauma can be seen in the structures that persist in American society. Generations of families were torn apart, stripped of agency, and forced to navigate a system that devalued their humanity. This trauma, psychological, social, and economic, was inherited. Children learned fear, caution, and resilience as survival strategies, and those lessons were passed down. Communities developed coping mechanisms, cultural practices, and traditions that carried both the weight of survival and the strength of endurance. Understanding the history of slave breeding is essential because it challenges comforting myths. It shatters the notion that slavery was only about labor or that it spared some humanity. It forces us to see the brutal realities enslaved people faced: sexual violence, forced reproduction, family separation, and psychological terror. It shows that the economy of slavery was built not just on physical toil, but on the commodification of life itself.
But acknowledging this history is not just about truth-telling, it is about honoring resilience. Despite unimaginable cruelty, enslaved people resisted, survived, and maintained their humanity. They protected each other in whatever ways they could, nurtured family bonds against all odds, and preserved cultural memory. They resisted with courage, intelligence, and ingenuity. Remembering these acts is just as important as remembering the horrors. Confronting this past also forces us to consider the present. How do we address the consequences of centuries of systemic exploitation and trauma? How do we ensure that stories that were hidden, minimized, or erased are finally heard? This history challenges educators, lawmakers, historians, and every citizen to reckon with the ways in which inequality is not accidental, but the result of centuries of deliberate systems of control. And it is personal. By learning the unvarnished truth about slavery, we gain a deeper understanding of the human cost behind wealth, power, and privilege in America. We see that oppression leaves scars not only on individuals, but on communities, culture, and the national conscience. This is why remembering, teaching, and discussing the realities of slave breeding is crucial. History cannot be rewritten, but it can be acknowledged, and acknowledging it gives us the power to change the future. It reminds us that human lives are never property, that families, love, and children are not commodities, that the mistakes and injustices of the past are lessons, warnings, and calls to action. If there is one takeaway from this series, it is this: the stories of enslaved people, of their suffering, resilience, and humanity must never be ignored. We remember not to dwell in guilt, but to foster understanding, empathy, and justice. History demands honesty, and honesty demands that we confront the truths we may find uncomfortable or painful. If this series has opened your eyes, subscribe to the channel for more untold histories. Share this video to spread awareness, and leave a comment below. What lesson from this history resonates most with you, and how can we honor the resilience of those who endured it? Because the stories that were almost erased, the ones filled with courage, trauma, and resistance, are the ones that matter most, and remembering them is the first step toward a more just and informed world.